project codenamed Star Wars Underworld was first announced at Celebration 3 in April 2005 by George Lucas, around the same time as the 2008 Star Wars The Clone Wars was also announced. It was planned to be a live-action Star Wars TV show set between the prequel and original trilogies, bridging and covering the gap during the Dark Times era of Star Wars between 19 BBY's Revenge of the Sith and 0 BBY's A New Hope, focusing on the seedy underbelly of the Coruscant underworld, and was a project that was promoted alongside Star Wars The Clone Wars and The Force Unleashed. While George Lucas had a writer's room collated, scripts written, and art directors hired onto the project, by 2011, Lucas announced the project was to be put on hold due to budget constraints. Star Wars Underworld's producers were George Lucas and Rick McCallum. The writer's room consisted of Ronald D. Moore, Steven Skyer, Chris Chibnall, Matthew Feiderman, Tony McNamara, Fiona Serras, Louise Fox, and Matthew Graham. The art department coordinator was Phil Shostak, with the concept designer supervisor being Eric Tiemans. The concept designers were David Hobbins, Jonathan Buck, Ryan Church, Fabian Lacey, and Kim-Man Chan. Art development started in late 2006 with just George Lucas, Jonathan Buck, and David Hobbins, this being after the Clone Wars would have been way underway on the development of its first season, considering that had concept art dating all the way back to mid-2005. Lucas and McCallum would have a huge worldwide search for Underworld's writers, meeting as many as 200 writers from the US, UK, and Australia. Writing would start in 2007, and between 48 to 60 plus third draft scripts were created for the series before it was put on hold. Lucas's plan was to have a big chunk of material written before production even started, even if many of these scripts weren't finalised and just in draft stages. Rick McCallum has stated that Ronald D. Moore was pretty much the head writer on the show. As mentioned in the Writer's Tale book by Benjamin Cook and Russell T. Davies, 2007 had George Lucas interested in getting Russell T. Davies as a writer for Underworld, but due to Russell being too busy on his multiple Doctor Who related projects, as well as not being able to travel to London with Lucas, also not being willing to travel to Cardiff to talk to him, Russell turned it down. However, in 2008, Russell T. Davies would also have an invite to Skywalker Ranch, though he had to cancel due to the increase in work he had to do on Doctor Who, Torchwood, and the Sarah Jane Adventures. With Russell moving to LA not long after this, it's possible he could have contributed something script-wise to the show before it was shelved. It's possible that Chris Chibnall was brought on after Russell T. Davies declined, due to both having worked on Torchwood. George Lucas's mandates for the show's scripts were to, quote, think big, and that their budget was not a problem. While casting for the show was meant to go ahead in 2008, it was delayed due to the scripts needing to be developed enough to be ready to start production. In 2010, concept footage of Underworld surfaced, which was available to watch, but not fully confirmed to be official until much later, with a Vanity Fair article. However, the footage is purely just a proof of concept and doesn't feature any of the script works done for the series. By 2010, the feasibility of producing the show was becoming unlikely, as the technology to produce it wasn't affordably available yet, with Lucas mandating that all the different stories were to be as big as Star Wars features. Rick McCallum, in a 2025 interview, said that the episodes cost more than the Star Wars feature films, with the lowest cost with the then current technology available being $40 million per episode. At some point, they tried to pitch the show to HBO, but the current CEO at the time got let go from the network just before he was scheduled to go to Skywalker Ranch and hear Lucas and McCallum's pitch for Underworld, with his replacement turning down any media waiting for any expensive productions. Lucas's increasing relationship and talks with Disney, alongside him appointing Kathleen Kennedy as his successor before selling the company altogether in October 2012, was the final nail in the coffin for Underworld. The majority of concept artists for Underworld had either already done concepts for previous Lucasfilm productions, or would go on to create concepts for live-action Star Wars movies or Disney Plus TV shows produced post the abandonment of Underworld. Over the years, many pieces of information has come out from various people who would have worked on Underworld, with details about different aspects of the show being revealed. Rick McCallum has stated that Underworld was to be dark, violent, and sexy, with drugs and prostitution being featured topics. The actual Coruscant Underworld itself, as the working title of the show suggests, was developed for this show, with the likes of an LE police gunship, the Coruscant Underworld Police Force, and the lower levels of the planet. The Clone Wars Season 2 episode, Lethal Trackdown, would be the first time Underworld's 1313 concept would be used in a finished project, when Ahsoka and Plo Koon have to travel into the criminal underworld to locate Aurra Sing. The Clone Wars Season 5 episodes, To Catch a Jedi and The Wrong Jedi, would show more of Level 1313, with the overall area being more developed, with the police force and police gunships that were planned for use in Underworld finally being used in a finished product. Further to this, we would also see other levels, including 1312 and 1315 within this story arc. Star Wars Rebels would also depict further use of the police gunship, though it would have an Imperial retexture, making it closer to the version that would have been depicted within Underworld. Clone Wars would have again featured more areas of the Coruscant Underworld in story arcs planned for its full 6th, 7th, and 8th release seasons. These stories would be cancelled before production could be completed, however, though 2 of these have since been released as part of a shorter quote final season and the novel Dark Disciple. The Coruscant Underworld would continue to get further on-screen depiction within the game Star Wars Jedi Survivor, with another level of the Underworld, 2046. This depiction is set during the Dark Times, like Star Wars Underworld, though is quite brief and is focused on Cal Kestis' conflict against a Pau'an senator. Episode 10 of Star Wars Andor would be the first time the Coruscant Underworld would be seen within a live-action Star Wars project. The Jedi Temple was to be retooled by Palpatine into his own Imperial Palace. This later came to pass post the Disney acquisition of Star Wars being featured in the 2014 Tarkin novel by James Luceno, before being depicted in the Vader comics and later getting a brief on-screen visual appearance in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. A bunch of legacy characters would have been used within Underworld, from appearing in a single story strand to potentially being reoccurring characters, with the most reoccurring of these being Boba Fett. Daniel Logan was wanted for this role, with him reportedly having been training for it in late 2007. This aligns with an early 2004 rumour before the project was officially announced that suggested that the show was to follow Boba Fett. Boba Fett would get a show of his own in 2021 with the Book of Boba Fett, set post Return of the Jedi, that ended up tying into The Mandalorian, which for many people was too Mandalorian focused, with Boba not doing anything for borderline 2 episodes of his own show, and Daniel Logan, who was planned to be the most reoccurring actor in Underworld, only getting a brief flashback scene. There was also to be a crew of bounty hunters, something which eventually was depicted within Star Wars The Clone Wars, initially in the episode Hostage Crisis, before a more long-term one was created for Season 4's bounty called Krait's Claw. Krait's Claw contains a character who was originally conceived for Star Wars Underworld, the combat droid C-21 High Singer. Boba Fett was not the only returning legacy character slated to appear, however, as Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine, Lando Calrissian, Han Solo, and Chewbacca were to also be featured within different stories. An earlier 2006 idea would have also featured Anthony Daniels' return as C-3PO, with 3PO himself going on to grace the TV space in several episodes of The Clone Wars and an episode of Star Wars Rebels via Anthony Daniels' voiceover, before ultimately making his live-action TV show debut in Star Wars Ahsoka. Probably the most well-known or talked about story idea that was planned to be included within Underworld was the depiction of Palpatine's backstory. Here it would have been established that his first name is Sheev, something else the Tarkin novel would adopt, but it would have also contradicted the Plagueis novel, which, like Tarkin, was also penned by James Luceno. The backstory would have seemingly not depicted Palpatine as always being evil, though we do not know the full context to this. Palpatine would have been, quote, wronged by an unknown heartless gangster woman. This would have supposedly made Palpatine more sympathetic and, quote, destroyed as a person. This most likely being depicted in either an episode that acted entirely as a flashback episode or during flashbacks for another narrative. Flashbacks during another narrative would ultimately be depicted within the 2017 movie The Last Jedi. Mas Amedda was at least going to be mentioned, as he was to be established as the Grand Vizier of the Empire, something else that the Tarkin novel would bring forward into a finished project, before Star Wars Andor would go on to reference it. The extremist rebel character Saw Gerrera was originally conceived for Star Wars Underworld. It would have also been established that the Republic would have trained him at some point during the Clone Wars to fight against the Separatists on his home planet. This Clone Wars backstory would become Saw Gerrera's entry into the Star Wars lore, being voiced by Andrew Kishino within Star Wars The Clone Wars' Onderon arc that aired as the premiere arc of Season 5. Saw's usage as an extremist rebel would come to pass in a finished project post the Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm, when he was used as a character in 2016's Rogue One, played by Forrest Whitaker. Saw Gerrera would gain further animated appearances in the 3rd and 4th seasons of Star Wars Rebels, depicting the Rogue One iteration of the character at an earlier point in his timeline, with his episodes released over the course of 2017. Forrest Whitaker reprised the role. Forrest Whitaker continued to voice Saw Gerrera for his appearance in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, released in 2019. Andrew Kishino got the chance to return to voice Saw Gerrera when he featured in Star Wars The Bad Batch, being featured in the 3rd part of its premiere episode Aftermath, and then the penultimate episode of Season 2, The Summit, depicting one of his earliest on-screen extremist acts against the Empire. Forrest Whitaker would return to play live-action Saw in Star Wars Andor, being featured in both of the show's seasons. Criminal syndicates were to be established within Star Wars Underworld. The most well-known of these is the Pikes, with them originally being designed as a concept for Underworld in 2007, and would have had connections to the Coruscant crime families. The Pike planet Obadiah was also created during Underworld's concept stage. Both of these would go on to be featured within episodes of Star Wars The Clone Wars, post Underworld being put on the shelf. The Season 5 episode Eminence depicting the Pikes themselves, and then the planet of Obadiah first being depicted in The Lost One, which was planned to air as part of a full 6th season of Star Wars The Clone Wars, but then became The Lost Missions episode 10 when The Clone Wars was cancelled mid-production, and the episode became one of 13 that were deemed too far along in the pipeline to abandon. Obadiah was planned to be a reoccurring location within Star Wars The Clone Wars, which was meant to be seen at least 2 more times within the show, had it not been cancelled. Another appearance within Season 6 would have expanded on the planet to show the Pike City, and would have featured at least Ahsoka and Nix Okami trying and failing to escape Pike capture, and then again during what would have been a more full-length traditional 7th season depicting Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Vos take a job from the same Pike leader who held Ahsoka and Nix prisoner. The job was to rescue his family from another criminal syndicate, the expanded universe originating Black Sun. The story arc with Ahsoka would be repurposed years later for the short 7th season of The Clone Wars on Disney+, and replacing Nix with the Martez sisters, but still depicting the same usage of Obadiah as the original planned Season 6 version of the story arc. The original Ventress Season 7 planned episode, featuring Obadiah, would become part of the Dark Disciple novel, adapting that production episode CW614, The Mission, into print media. The design of a Pike ship, presumably created during Underworld's concept phase, was reused for the Nile starship, the New Elite, in the High Republic era. Another, lesser known and still sadly at the making of this video, undepicted criminal syndicate was called the Crymora. The Crymora Syndicate would be involved with the droid Gotra, who would act as the Crymora's security. The Gotra would contain a bunch of still active battle droids post their Revenge of the Sith shutdown, who would gain some level of sentience. A level of droid sentience would later be depicted in Solo: A Star Wars Story with the character of L337. There was to be a story about an uprising on Coruscant that would have Darth Vader try to snuff it out in retaliation. This would have apparently been Vader's only appearance in the show and was intended as a 2-part story. As it's also been said that Vader was to fight against the Crymora, it suggests they were involved within this story also. Star Wars Episode 9 almost featured the Coruscant Underworld during Colin Trevorrow's Duel of the Fates iteration of the project, which also would have featured the Citizens' Uprising. The Canon Thrawn novel would establish that major crime and unrest was happening on the lower levels of Coruscant during the era of the Empire. Despite having yet to be directly depicted within a finished story, the Crymora Syndicate has been referenced within the Vader comics and the Tarkin novel, with the latter stating that Vader has had dealings with the Crymora, as well as the existence of the droid Gotra, which is elaborated further within the novel Most Wanted, where they state that the droid Gotra are well-known terrorists, before again being referenced within The Mandalorian in Chapter 9, The Marshal. The Bad Batch Season 2 episode, Tribe, features the Vanguard Axis, a confirmed offshoot of the droid Gotra. Star Wars Jedi Survivor, while not specifically featuring the droid Gotra itself, would feature another example of a rogue criminal faction reusing separatist battle droids, the Bedlam Raiders. Though, the Bedlam Raider droids, unlike the Gotra, aren't as independently programmed. Jabba the Hutt was to work with the Crymora to gain prominence and power within the Hutt clan. This is something that the reference books Ultimate Star Wars and the 2016 Character Encyclopedia have since stated. Jabba being featured in the show would be further supported by unconfirmed details of the inclusion of Bib Fortuna and Ola in Underworld, both being Jabba-centric characters. Bib Fortuna almost made it into the Clone Wars movie, having his design depicted in the Art of the Clone Wars book, before finally getting depicted in a finished Lucasfilm animation project via the first season of The Bad Batch. The Rang Clang, originally an Underworld concept, is referenced in both the unfinished Clone Wars Dark Disciple arc turned novel, as well as within Star Wars Rebels, with leaks also suggesting that they were to be featured in the cancelled game referred to as Project Ragtag. Separatist holdouts would be featured in the series, again being something that the Tarkin novel would ultimately bring into the lore, before Star Wars Rebels Season 3 would depict the final Separatist holdout within the episode The Last Battle. Another Separatist holdout was depicted in the Bad Batch Season 2 episode The Solitary Clone, being at the opposite end of the Dark Times. Rebel cells forming together to form the rebellion is also something Underworld would have depicted, and is yet again another idea that would ultimately be depicted within another finished project, this being Star Wars Rebels, and it will also most likely tie into a live action project with the second season of Andor, which will be in the middle of releasing its episodes by the time this video comes out. A clone bar, the 79s, would have been depicted within Star Wars Underworld, having many members of the former Republic clone army dealing with their trauma caused by Order 66. This bar would ultimately be featured within the Clone Wars episode Orders, released as the 4th episode of the shortened Lost Mission season, before reappearing again in the 2nd season Bad Batch episode The Clone Conspiracy. The same Clone Wars arc would also align up with the clones having PTSD from Order 66 by establishing that the clones were not complicit with Order 66 and were instead used as pawns by Palpatine to kill the Jedi generals they had come to fight side by side with. The clones' increased aging would have been depicted, as well as Palpatine having decommissioned them in favour of conscripted individuals as stormtroopers. This would later come to pass within Star Wars Rebels, depicting aged clones and stormtroopers who are confirmed to be non-clone conscripted individuals who train from a young age. The Bad Batch, released later, would depict the beginning of the clones' replacement with stormtroopers. The concept of Empire Day was created for Star Wars Underworld. This would ultimately be used in Star Wars Rebels and connected to Ezra Bridger by establishing that he was born on the very same day. A Church of the Force religion consisting of non-Force sensitives existed within the shadows of the Coruscant Underworld. The Church of the Force would later be depicted within The Force Awakens with the character of Lor San Tekka. Rogue One's visual guide would confirm the Church of the Force has a growing presence within the shadows of Coruscant. Vader trying to backstab Palpatine with an acolyte/apprentice of his own would have potentially been explored, with George Lucas describing Palpatine and Vader during the 19 years between his two trilogies as like cheating spouses, always trying to find a better apprentice behind each other's back. Though, this might have ultimately been more for the Force Unleashed game instead, as it's been previously stated that Vader was to only appear in one story, and unless they can somehow tie the Coruscant Uprising and Crymora conflict in with Vader secretly getting a new apprentice, I doubt it would have been depicted. However, George Lucas was known to change his mind as time went on, so Vader could have potentially become more of a reoccurring character had the show been developed further. Speaking of The Force Unleashed, it has been rumoured that characters from it were to appear within the show. A bunch of characters with connections to existing ones would have potentially appeared within the show, including Fal Joban, a speed racer from the same time frame as the show, who was previously depicted within Star Wars Droids, a rebel general called Durran, who is potentially related to the expanded universe character Kip Durran, who was a Jedi Master of Luke's New Order and who held an anti-Imperial rampage, a rebel with Padme's family surname of Naberi, and a General Papanoida. Fal Joban's inclusion would have continued the prequel trilogy's trend of including elements from Star Wars Droids. With it possible, Fal would have had an episode exploring illegal speeder racing on Coruscant, with the Empire outlawing pod racing. This would have been a callback to Lucas's sophomore movie, American Graffiti. This could have been part of the additional focus on Star Wars' entertainment industry that the show could have included, with Lucas publicly never mentioning anything specific about it. Had any characters with expanded universe connections been included, they would have most likely had detail changes within the guidelines of Lucas personally regarding the expanded universe as a separate world from his own, with the EU connections most likely being things other members who were or would have been involved in Underworld's production added as nods to past stories, with Lucas approving their usage in a limited capacity, as he also did with the Clone Wars. Ultimately, the Papanoidas would be explored within the Clone Wars Season 3 episode, Spear of Influence. The Sugi, a species who specialised in arms dealing, were created for Star Wars Underworld. They were almost depicted within the 6th season of Star Wars The Clone Wars within the Crystal Crisis on Utapau story arc, but this story was left unfinished when The Clone Wars was cancelled in March 2013, with the story arc being written off when the 6th season was ultimately cut in half and turned into The Lost Missions. Another Underworld aspect that would have been depicted within that story arc is the confirmation of giant kyber crystals being the Death Star super laser's power source. This is something that was assumed to be canon despite the story arc's unfinished status before the 4th season of Star Wars Rebels would confirm this within a finished project, with the story also featuring Underworld alumni Saw Gerrera following breadcrumbs to discover the Empire's superweapon. Rogue One's story was initially pitched as a plotline for Underworld way back in 2005, though it ultimately wasn't scripted for the series. It, alongside Rebels, continued to confirm that the Death Star was powered by kyber crystals, as Underworld and Crystal Crisis on Utapau would have established. While Lucas initially did not want to depict how Han acquired the Falcon, this alongside how Han and Chewie met was said by one of the writers to have been scripted for the series. This story would ultimately become its own project, Solo, a Star Wars story. It seems that this story initially inspired certain elements of Ahsoka's walkabout, like Nixo Kami's characterization as a younger, inexperienced version of Han, with the story arc even potentially intended to be a substitute for it when Underworld was put on the shelf, before Solo ultimately came along and repurposed the entire concept into a movie, though they apparently did not read any of the script work for Underworld when creating it. A Boba Fett anthology movie was initially planned that would have potentially used ideas from Underworld, with it most likely also planned to feature a crew of bounty hunters. The movie has been described as a bounty hunter heist movie, and it's rumoured that this planned movie could be the reason why the unfinished Clone Wars bounty hunter arc wasn't completed as part of the Lost Missions, with it being the final and only story arc from that show's 5th production season to be left unfinished. A Jabba the Hutt movie by Guillermo del Toro was in the pipeline at some point. This could have repurposed the part of Underworld that would have had Jabba gain power within the Hutt clan via the Crymora Syndicate. As described in examples stated, the Clone Wars as it went on got more and more pieces from Underworld added to it, and this practice also continued since the Disney acquisition of Star Wars within their many projects, as also previously stated. Both Kathleen Kennedy in 2015 and Dave Filoni in 2022 have said that they continue to have interest in reusing Underworld's mine of content within other projects. The final thing for this section is very recent, and that is the title of Underworld. It has now been repurposed for the 3rd season of the Tales of Lucasfilm animation shorts, focusing on 2 Clone Wars characters, Cad Bane and Asajj Ventress, and also featuring the return of Underworld originating character C-21 High Singer. In this section, I will talk about things that are less certain. While it's implied that Underworld would have only been set on Coruscant, it's highly likely this wasn't actually the case, with the confirmation of elements like Palpatine's backstory and how Han acquired the Falcon being stories that would no doubt take place on different planets. The per-episode budget being more than the movies also would suggest that the locations would not purely be just the Underworld. We also have to remember that Underworld was just a codename for the project, with the final name, had it ever got one, potentially being something that would have established the show as something more further reaching. The Pike's connection to the spice trade was most likely something developed for Star Wars Underworld, including the depiction of the Kessel spice mines as featured within Rebels, Solo, and the final version of the Ahsoka's Walkabout arc. This would most likely also extend to the clean side of Kessel that is also depicted in the latter, with the royal families being mentioned. The clean side was designed during the production of that story arc's original Season 6 iteration containing Nixo Kami. It's possible that what became the Inquisitorius started out as an idea for Underworld before the early Rebels talks involving them began in October 2012, with the Clone Wars Season 2 Children of the Force episode having Palpatine state that he wanted to have a dark army of Force users. something that would have most likely happened during the in-universe timeframe of Underworld, after Order 66 and before A New Hope, where Tarkin states that Vader is the only one left. Though if it's anything like how Lucas treated the cloaking ship in Clone Wars, he might have not cared about that line of dialogue from Tarkin and have it contextualised differently. Saw Gerrera's extremist rebel origin and reaction to the Imperial takeover of his homeworld could have potentially been depicted in Underworld, still being an event that we have yet to see. A Jedi bounty hunter was possibly going to be featured. This could have been Quinlan Vos, which would have potentially done its own alterations to the expanded universe. This idea could have been what inspired the idea of Quinlan Vos's bounty hunter partnership with Asajj Ventress during the unfinished Dark Disciple Clone Wars arc turned novel. The show would have also potentially featured a young Leia Organa, which would ultimately come to pass in the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV show. This could also suggest appearances from Jimmy Smits as Bail Organa would have happened, considering his relation to Leia. Further to this, I would not be surprised if Mon Mothma and other senators would have also had a story continuing on from the Padme deleted scenes of Revenge of the Sith, showing us the state of the Senate during the 19 years of the Empire, where it existed before it got dissolved, something we would ultimately get to see within Star Wars Andor. I speculate that maybe the Empire's genocide of the Geonosians could have happened within the show, something stories since have followed up on, aligning up with how the show would have explained that the Death Star was powered by kyber crystals. It could have had a story focused specifically on dealing with the prequel additions to the Death Star's creation. A story told since in other media focuses on Panaka, who became a Moff under the Empire, being close to figuring out the true identity of Leia Organa as Padme's daughter before being killed by Saw's partisans. This could have been a story meant to feature in Underworld, though this would have had to have been during the time between Panaka's removal from the Clone Wars' first season and the shelving of Underworld, considering Panaka was originally planned to die by Grievous's hand. Considering the confirmation of clones being featured in some capacity, it's possible that they had a story where we would see a senator in the Senate fight for clone rights after they were retired, something that the Bad Batch would ultimately do within its second and third seasons. There are several major other unfinished Star Wars projects that have connections to Star Wars Underworld. The first of these that I will discuss is the 40 episodes of Star Wars The Clone Wars that were planned to take the show to 8 full seasons but were left unfinished due to the March 2013 mid-production cancellation. These episodes would have no doubt continued to have more content reused from the shelved Underworld project, bar the few I've already mentioned with the unfinished Crystal Crisis on Utapau story arc. The Canon Kessel spice mines that most likely have their roots tied back to Star Wars Underworld were supposed to appear before the Season 6 iteration of Ahsoka's Walkabout, this being in the second episode of the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc, with the production code CW523, the design for this episode being created by Amy Beth Christensen. The location would have been modelled based off of this design for use within that episode's unproduced story reel that, like the other three for the Bounty Hunter arc, has unfortunately never been shared with the public beyond one clip from CW522 and one clip from CW525. This design and location model that was most likely inspired by unused concepts for Underworld has since gone on to inspire the usage of the spice mines within Kessel's usage in Rebels, Solo, and the final version of the Ahsoka's Walkabout arc. Boba's Crate's Claw Syndicate, including Highsinger, was slated to make return appearances, having a starring role in the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc, with some of its members present at a duel between Boba and Cad Bane, resulting in the latter's planned death and Boba's rise as a notorious bounty hunter. Further to this, the Syndicate was to appear in a lesser role in the unfinished plans for the original 7th and 8th seasons, being a reoccurring bounty hunter group with the likes of Highsinger, Bosk, Embo, and Latz Razzie appearing alongside Ventress, who herself is also established as a bounty hunter by this point. Another thing I think was repurposed from Underworld into unfinished Clone Wars episodes is its continued usage of criminal syndicates. It seems likely that the Shadow Collective would have continued to be a presence throughout multiple of the unfinished Clone Wars arcs, with them potentially being a linked thread that was lingering in the background and would come into play when the story required. Especially in story arcs like the Unfinished Bounty Hunter arc, the Dark Disciple arc, and the Son of Dathomir arc, which was seemingly originally intended to completely break the Syndicate apart by its conclusion, as story arcs planned to come after this seemed to veer away from featuring criminal syndicates, though they could have featured briefly in one more, that being the unfinished Sith Shrine arc that delved into the lowest levels of Coruscant. There is a Dave Filoni sketch that was most likely created during the story conference sessions for said Sith Shrine arc of an experienced vigilante Ahsoka fighting a droid with a staff. This droid not only shares a design with the initial concept designs for the Trade Federation droids meant for the Phantom Menace, but also reminds me of the droid Gotra. Maybe the story arc would have opened with Ahsoka getting on the wrong side of the droid Gotra or Crymora, with the droid Gotra most likely having a different origin compared to the Underworld one due to the story arc being set during the Clone Wars, which could have been done on the basis that with Underworld being shelved, they thought they might never get to depict the droid Gotra in anything else. It's also possible that a version of the Church of the Force could have appeared in the unfinished Sith Shrine arc, considering their status of hiding in Coruscant shadows, places that Ahsoka, being an experienced vigilante in the lower levels, could have potentially encountered. Maybe she was drawn down to the lower depths because of them or the Crymora. The Church of the Force could have originated from individuals who, despite believing in the Jedi teachings, do not support their involvement with the Republic Senate, something that Ahsoka during this arc would also share. The initial opening of the arc could have had Ahsoka being a vigilante for the Church of the Force to stop the droid Gotra doing something shady in the lower depths, with it being possible that the entire first episode of the arc would have focused more on where Ahsoka is at in her vigilante arc, before ending on her discovering the danger, and then having the story arc's other 3 episodes be the parts where she works with Anakin and Obi-Wan to try and rescue Yoda. Maybe Ahsoka created the Church of the Force herself. She would fit the mold of being someone who knows of the Jedi teachings, but also being disillusioned from their involvement in the Republic, and Obi-Wan in the unfinished Crystal Crisis arc regards her actions as still being very Jedi-like. The Church of the Force could have been something Ahsoka started, but then as she got caught up with the events of the Sith Shrine arc, ended up leaving, with them carrying on her teachings without her. Palpatine making the Jedi Temple the Imperial Palace could have also been alluded to within this story arc, with it being directly above the Sith Shrine. The Geonosians being involved in the unfinished Sith Shrine arc could be a potential explanation for the creation of the droid Gotra, with them maybe even secretly creating a new droid army in the lower depths of the Republic capital that could become the droid Gotra. The droids could have lost their Geonosian leaders after the Empire wiped out their species, leading to the Crymora taking them over. While not confirmed, Padme's rumoured relative from Underworld could have ended up appearing in her final Clone Wars arc if it somehow incorporated her family, who were included in deleted scenes from Attack of the Clones and featured at her funeral in Revenge of the Sith. As the arc would have likely repurposed the plot from Revenge of the Sith deleted scenes, maybe the arc would have also included some of the things from Padme's Attack of the Clones ones. Considering these latter 2 arcs only ever made it to first or draft scripts, these elements could have not been included at the time their development was cancelled, but could have been added later during production, as how George Lucas would produce his projects, with Clone Wars Season 1 head writer Henry Gilroy stating on the Clone Wars movie commentary that the script is only the beginning with George Lucas, with him still writing and changing things both big and small throughout a project's entire production. Star Wars 1313 is said to have been the sister project to Star Wars Underworld, being a tie-in to the TV show. Initially, however, 1313 was to focus on an original character who wasn't Boba Fett. This is before George Lucas saw what the team were doing and decided to share more and more Underworld-related information with them, eventually evolving the game to have Boba Fett be the main protagonist. Multiple aspects of Underworld were going to be shown within 1313, the crime families of the Pikes, the Rang Clan, and the Suji arms dealers, as well as Boba Fett and Highsinger working for these criminal gangs. C-21 Highsinger was also going to at some point betray Boba Fett, an event that could be referenced within the upcoming, at the time of the making of this video, Tales of the Underworld, which based on its promotional information only features Latz and C-21 and not Boba and any other members of Crate's Claw. The Clone Wars team collaborated with the team on the 1313 game to make the world consistent when visiting the Coruscant Underworld within the animated TV series. A lot of the released concept designs for 1313 come from concepts initially created for Underworld, with the game further developing than many different areas, with concept designers from Underworld crossing over into the development of the game. The planet Scipio, which eventually was depicted in the Banking Clan Crisis Clone Wars arc, was initially planned for 1313. Due to 1313's heavy tie into Star Wars Underworld, it isn't that far-fetched to assume that Scipio could have been created for Underworld and later added into 1313 and then Clone Wars in a similar way to the Underworld itself. Post-Underworld being put on the shelf, however, it seems that the time content from it was potentially repurposed into the unfinished Clone Wars Bounty Hunter arc. 1313 was going to have Boba's outfit gradually progress and evolve into his original trilogy setup by the end of the game, as Boba Fett in the unfinished arcs, while seemingly getting the carbine rifle from the Zabrak called Suji, is not featured using it in the unfinished real clip for his later CW616 Dark Disciple appearance, instead still having his father's twin Westar 34 blaster pistols, as well as not having a jetpack, despite the fact that during Celebration 2012, Lucasfilm released a render of Boba Fett before he had a bullet hole in his helmet, but with his jetpack and carbine rifle seen in the original trilogy, with the render seeming more like a mock-up render using existing assets in a similar vein to the Darth Vindica Ventress image featured in Star Wars The Clone Wars Magazine 5's What If the Night Sisters Supercharged Ventress. It seems to me that his final appearance in the Clone Wars, which would have been in the premiere arc of Season 8, the Saving Voss arc that was ultimately repurposed for the latter half of the Dark Disciple novel adaptation, would have also not had him appear with the carbine rifle or jetpack, and that Lucasfilm would have left the story of how he progressed to using those to the 1313 game. It's possible that the entire Bounty Hunter arc came about after Underworld was put on the shelf in the early 2010s, with 1313 itself probably also getting more and more content from Underworld post it being shelved. Future David here. Lucasfilm have shared another clip from the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc during Celebration 2025, showing a scene of Anakin chasing Boba Fett in his armour with his jetpack. We don't know which production episode it is, but I assume it's from CW524, as that's the one we know the least about. But Boba still somehow loses the jetpack by the end of the arc, and still doesn't use Suji's blaster as seen within the mock renders. The exact canon status of 1313 seems to be in the same grey area as the 40 unfinished Clone Wars episodes, with Boba Fett himself, during this era, being something that Lucasfilm have been avoiding ever since the cancellation of both the Clone Wars and 1313. So if he does appear in Tales of the Underworld, it could be an indication that they are finally ready to define the status of both of those unfinished projects. There is a certain level of crossover with what Lucas had planned for his sequel trilogy and what would have been in Star Wars Underworld. George Lucas would go back and forth on whether he wanted to do sequels, at some point even having a vision for a 12-part trilogy before he whittled it down to 6 movies come Return of the Jedi. Come the end of Revenge of the Sith, Lucas still wanted there to be no more movies, instead focusing his attention to Star Wars television with his plans for both the Clone Wars and Underworld. Lucas did want to revive Maul, something I would not be surprised if it was at least considered first for the Underworld project, with Clone Wars initially having a lot of restrictions on it, with Lucas not wanting to include certain aspects in the show, like bounty hunters, that would have presumably been a big focus in Underworld. By the planning of the Clone Wars' 4th production season, however, George Lucas had liked the character of Savage Opress within animation, so decided to get the Clone Wars team to incorporate Maul into the Night Sisters story arc later in its development, and have that lead into a story arc directly reviving Maul, both of these being written by his daughter, Katie Lucas. Come the early 2010s, when Underworld was becoming more and more unlikely to be produced, it seems that they decided to include another idea from Underworld by having Maul create a criminal syndicate within the show, bringing in the Pikes from Underworld, before then initially planning to kill Maul off at the conclusion of the same arc. This was probably during a time when both Underworld was on ice and Lucas still didn't want to do sequels. Later in development of The Lawless, Maul's death was undone, with extra Palpatine dialogue recorded by Tim Curry being added to confirm his survival. This was potentially bringing back Lucas's idea of featuring Maul within a revived Lucas sequel trilogy that could have repurposed certain ideas from Underworld that didn't make Clone Wars itself, that while not affordable to produce as a live-action TV show, could have had Lucas use elsewhere. Maul running a syndicate post the Clone Wars would come to pass in Solo: A Star Wars Story, which then retroactively undid the collapse of his syndicate that was established to happen within the unfinished Clone Wars arc turned comic, Son of Dathomir. This was further confirmed in the finalised version of the Siege of Mandalore arc that briefly incorporated Maul's syndicate into it, as well as incorporate Maul in the finalised version of Ahsoka's Walkabout, with him being captured by Sidious during the timeline of the original version of that arc, implying that Olmec was running the syndicate during that time instead, as established at the start of the Son of Dathomir comic. Sequel Maul wouldn't have featured much in Lucas's Episode 7 anyway, with him being treated like how Palpatine was in A New Hope, as well as Snoke in The Force Awakens, with them initially focusing much more on Darth Talon. This is similar to how Maul only cameoed in Solo: A Star Wars Story, with it being implied, had there been more stories continuing that plot strand, that he'd appear more frequently, like was to be expected within Lucas's sequel story treatments. Ultimately, Maul and Talon were replaced with Snoke and Kylo Ren for Episode 7, and thus Lucasfilm decided to end Maul's story much earlier than intended, with him dying at Obi-Wan's hands with the knowledge that Luke would avenge them both. Due to Maul's activity in the criminal underworld during the era Star Wars Underworld takes place in within the current continuity, it's always possible that there will be a future show featuring him during this time frame that potentially repurposes more aspects of things originating from Star Wars Underworld. Future David returns again with another update from Star Wars Celebration 2025, which has confirmed that this is exactly what Lucasfilm Animation is doing next, even potentially bringing in Darth Talon as Maul's new apprentice. Lucas had created story treatments for episodes 7, 8 and 9, and it has been said that Lucas was in contact with the original trilogy actors about a sequel trilogy before he ultimately decided to sell Lucasfilm. While the characters could have appeared as younger versions in Underworld, they would have obviously been recast. Another aspect that could have been featured in Lucas's sequels was the idea of Saw Gerrera. It's always possible that his extremist ways would have led him to not see the New Republic as any better than the Empire, becoming a potential threat with his death in Rogue One, being something that obviously wouldn't have been planned at this stage, with the same thing happening to Maul in Rebels. Lucas's sequels would have had Luke try and rebuild the Jedi Order with a handful of Order 66 survivors. Underworld could have very well depicted some of those said survivors, with it also being possible that any such character or characters could have then gone on to be considered for inclusion in the sequels when Underworld was put on the shelf. The idea of separatist holdouts would have been repurposed as Imperial holdouts, with there being groups of stormtroopers that don't accept the New Republic. This idea was partially repurposed in The Mandalorian with Gideon's Imperial Remnant. It's implied that Lucas reviving the idea of doing sequels was a direct result of not being able to produce Underworld. I personally think it's such a shame that this show was never produced, with it being a bit too early in the making before we had multiple major streaming services that would have budgeted it. While Lucas is known for having done things ahead of the game, it unfortunately caught up with him here, where it was a bit too ambitious for even him to afford and pull off. I believe that Underworld would have been one of the most ambitious TV shows of its kind. It would have also been interesting to see how a project with more direct involvement from George Lucas would have implemented all of the bits of lore that we have since seen crop up elsewhere within the franchise. According to producer Rick McCallum, the show's existence within the IP would have deterred Disney from acquiring Lucasfilm, which, depending on who you ask, is either a good or bad thing. To me, it feels like Underworld would have had a structure similar to latter seasons of the Clone Wars, with it having story arcs that would focus on a variety of different characters, potentially not having a single character that would appear in every single episode, unlike the shows we get today, which seem to always be focused around a specific character or characters. While Boba Fett would have been the most featured, I can see entire stories without him being relevant, such as the Vader Uprising one. You can definitely see a shift with how much the Clone Wars took from Underworld once the show was put on the shelf in the early 2010s, with them deciding to put more and more into the Clone Wars from Underworld the longer the show went on, presumably due to it becoming ever increasingly apparent that the only way these ideas would get to be used would be within animation, where they could actually pull off these ideas within an affordable budget. Considering Lucasfilm have essentially been drip-feeding bits and pieces from Underworld into other content, it makes me wonder what they will do when the content inevitably dries up. The show being live action would have not had that annoying stigma that some people have with the likes of the Clone Wars, where they dismiss it purely because it's animated, something I do not understand, as something doesn't have to be acted out on screen by real people to be valid, as well as the fact that animation is able to pull off a hell of a lot more than live action can on the same budget. Also, being a fan of Doctor Who and Torchwood makes me wonder how the work of Chris Chibnall on Underworld would have compared to his work on those shows, as well as his other non-Doctor Who related series like Broadchurch. Rick McCallum describing Underworld as dark, violent and sexy also reminds me of Torchwood, with Underworld seeming like it would have been a Star Wars version of that, but on a clearly much higher budget and a much larger scale, with many different characters instead of a specific group like that show had. Reading a bunch of quotes from George Lucas around 2006 to 2007 has him stating that the show was to focus more on minor characters featured previously within Star Wars, alluding to the show being more about what is now commonly referred to as glup shittos and expanding on them. This reminds me about how Mon Mothma used to fill in that role before she appeared in Star Wars Andor, and further makes me speculate that maybe she would have been one of the many characters expanded on within the show. Darth Maul, before he was revived in the Clone Wars, could also fit the definition of glup shitto, where he only had a few lines of dialogue in The Phantom Menace and acted purely as a pawn of Sidious. I do think, however, that Lucas could have changed his mind had they been able to produce this show and seen what the potential of it was, that maybe he would have expanded on some more prominent characters too, which is alluded to have happened with the writers talking about things like Darth Vader being featured, the show containing Palpatine's backstory, or specific elements in Han Solo's life. While some of the story ideas have been repurposed within other projects, there are still many we have yet to see. At the making of this video, we still have yet to see what a bunch of Clone Wars characters did during the Dark Times, including a young Boba Fett, who was to be featured within this show. His lack of exploration within this time frame comes off as if they are purposely avoiding it due to it potentially conflicting with content either Underworld or 1313 would have done, despite the fact we have never been told one way or the other whether those stories are counted as happening, unlike the unfinished Clone Wars arcs that have been described as core story canon. Another character who potentially featured somewhat in the show, a Jedi bounty hunter Quinlan Vos. He's another who has a big question mark during the era of Underworld within the current canon, though considering the reviving of Ventress, I do hope that that will get answered soon. They could even do a canon version of his expanded universe counterpart and have him have a child with Ventress, who has been shown herself to have an affinity with children, as depicted within the CW 614 The Mission section of the Dark Disciple arc, as well as with the siblings in the Clone Wars' Bounty episode, and Omega in the Bad Batch. And not to mention the recently revealed Padawan character in the still yet to be released at the time this video was made, Tales of the Underworld. While I don't dislike Solo a Star Wars story, besides it alluding to Aurra Singh's planned Clone Wars death being retconned, something I personally don't believe due to Beckett's deception later in the movie anyway, I think having Han meet Chewie and Han acquire the Falcon from Lando within Underworld would have probably felt less like a checklist of Han's backstory that Solo can come off as being like. This is due to it potentially being things that are depicted within two separate story strands, instead of all being set within one ongoing story. We know that Lucas did toy with having a young Han be featured on Kashyyyk during Revenge of the Sith, which would suggest him meeting Chewie was something that was at one point going to be separate from acquiring the Falcon. Another aspect this show could have delved into is the backstabbing between Palpatine and Vader both trying to replace each other. This is an area currently overlooked in the canon that I think deserves an exploration on its own. A big story I am intrigued with is the backstory of Palpatine. While it's easy for people to write it off and assume it's awful because of an out-of-context quote by someone who worked on the show, I don't think it deserves criticism without us knowing the full context. The same is true with the unfinished Bounty Hunter arc duel, featuring a character progress Boba. We don't know what the characters have been through. We need to experience the character arc in full before we should judge them. Just because some people don't like it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. Headcanons exist, and if The Rise of Skywalker is allowed to revive Palpatine based on a line of dialogue from Revenge of the Sith that was initially purely just manipulation to get Anakin on side, then why can't this happen? They've already canonized his first name from the Underworld backstory anyway. It's easy to assume Palpatine is evil just because he always was. In my opinion, it would have been interesting to see exactly what made Palpatine's level of evil, what caused him to become a complete vessel of the dark side that contains so much hate and selfishness. It would have added additional layers to his character beyond the master deceiver and manipulator we know him to ultimately become. Who's to say that the story wasn't actually Palpatine feeling wronged by this gangster woman because she disapproved of his dark side tendencies and ultimate goal, with the story potentially being told from his point of view, where his bias tells him that it's her fault. Palpatine could have been portrayed as a narcissist who is incapable of realizing he is the problem. Ultimately, while Underworld is even less likely to get finished than the 40 unfinished episodes of the Clone Wars that continue to get specific references, it does make me see potential for a more adult-skewed Star Wars animated project which could incorporate some of its themes, however unlikely. We could perhaps get a version of Palpatine's backstory inspired by the Underworld iteration one day, potentially in a Tales of series like what we've had with Count Dooku and what we're getting with Cad Bane, with canon being something that's more there for marketing at this rate than it is for continuity between mediums. People can always just ignore Palpatine's backstory if they dislike it and focus on enjoying the parts of Star Wars they do. I now have an active channel membership available. This will grant you exclusive perks like emojis in the comments, usernames listed in my outros, and updates to what's coming next posted exclusively for members in the community tab. But the best feature is you get 5 days early access to new videos and you will be supporting me at the same time. To find out more, you can click the join button on my channel page. Thank you to anyone who considers becoming a channel member. Thank you for watching. Please see the video description below for interesting links, sources, and credits. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and comment. My current goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers. Until the next time, goodbye.